Okay, Sam, with copper in BC, are super flow-through financings available?
Yeah. So we not only we call them different things, right? So our last funding, last two fundings have been a combination of super flow through. Well, it would be charity flow through, which two fundings ago we got a 60% premium to back end, which is fantastic. So we're a company that we obviously know the markets, right? And traditional flow through funding is a bit of a challenge for us because people are looking for the tax credit and they don't really care about the stock. And so you usually get a lot of flow back after 4 months when the hold comes off. So we actually did not do a traditional flow through funding last December. We did it all critical metals charity flow through, or half critical metals charity flow through and the other half normal charity flow through. And the difference between this is that we find our back end buyer. And in this case, it was Franklin Templeton. So these are long-term holders of the stock. And then we can get that critical metals charity premium. And in this case, it was 70% premium to the back end buyer. And we can only access that because we're in Canada and BC does have a reasonably favorable structure compared to a lot of other provinces, but also is because we're critical metals, right? So I think the good news for shareholders and people that are looking to invest in our stock, you can be certain that we are never going to do something that we feel is going to impair the share price inorganically in the future, right? So the flow back you get for these traditional flow through shares can be very, very challenging for shareholders to absorb because it's just indiscriminate, right? It just comes out. We don't have any of those shares coming out. We don't have any warrants on our balance sheet now. And the only warrants we gave was through a funding 2 years ago to two very, very highly respected individuals, Michael Gentili and Pierre Benoit, who've now since exercised those warrants and have just doubled down on their support for the company. So we have no warrants anymore. We don't have any flow back coming from flow through shares that are traditional flow through shares because it was all back end. The last deal was all back end. So we're in a really good position. I also would like to say the last deal was only done at I think it was a 9% discount with no half warrant or warrant. So, you could be certain that with 5 individuals owning 45% of the company, shareholders, dilution is a big thing for us. And we would never do anything that would cause overtly share price weakness just to raise capital today, right? That's what I was referring to before. The great thing about having a very supportive shareholder base is you're able to do good financing, solid long-term financings without having to kick the can down the road for 4 months and then just see all this flow back come back. So it's a really good question because it's another thing that really differentiates us from the junior crowd. And I think that's why we've advanced and we're emerging towards being a significant company.
There is a lot of indication that the junior mining sector, specifically in copper and related in gold, is finally in an upswing in the very long down portion of the cycle. It's obvious that the assets of North Isle and the relations with First Nations is excellent. So what is a reasonable timeline of various next stages like a feasibility study? Lastly, what's the end game? Junior mining investors often look to a buyout as their payday. Is a buyout by a major the plan, or is going it alone with a low capex starter pit in the direction that this is headed?
Yeah. So I'll answer the first question as it relates to the prescribed timelines in British Columbia on how to permit a project, right? And keep in mind, these prescribed timelines in British Columbia have a massive flex period for which if you don't have proper consultation consent from your communities and First Nations, that could flex to infinity, right? And that's why we're taking this proactive approach right now to ensure that once it goes into the government's hands, this is the consent agreements that we have in place, it will have already been agreed upon by our First Nation partners and ourselves, right? As opposed to it being referred back to the First Nations and them just saying, I've never even seen this before, right? And that's the way to build trusting, long partnerships in our industry. And it hasn't been done nearly enough, if at all, thus far. So the prescribed timelines in British Columbia is 2 years baseline, 2 years permitting. And we're now seeing and then the PEA and study work, feasibility, feasibility study, that takes less time than that 4-year period that I've just defined, right? So the limiting factor or the critical path is actually the baseline and the permitting. And right now, the government, obviously with the critical metal strategy mandate forefront in their minds, is looking to contract that period, not by reducing those two sides, but overlapping those two sides. So we'll see what that looks like coming out. So it can be potentially contracted, but in the end, that's kind of the timeline that we have in our mind if we were able to press a button today. The second question was, what's the end goal here? Okay, so I always believe that M&A is an outcome of really good work. It's not a strategy. Like if you say our goal is to get taken out, chances are that you're going to be seduced by your own expectations in a good and a bad way. And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't turn out the way you want it. That's kind of my observation as an outsider looking in for the last 20 years. Now I'm strongly of the belief that M&A, crystallization, getting taken out is just an outcome of doing really, really good work. Okay. So what we're doing right now is we are trying to systematically solve all of the problems we can solve right now that makes us perhaps not a today investment, right? So if it means that we're too small, well, guess what? Pemberton Hills, that could be the absolute game changer if we find the buried deep porphyry, right? That could be the potential. I'm not even going to say it, but maybe that could be the game changer, right? It's exploration. Everyone knows that. I'm not saying we're going to do it, but we've already done 2 holes of 14. So, we're trying. We're at least swinging here. If the comment is, well, you're too big. How are you going to develop a $1.4 billion CapEx project? Well, the answer is Northwest Expo, right? Because if you contemplate a 15 to 20,000 ton per day project versus a 70,000 ton per day project, which is Hishamu, and if the margins are 3 times, or excuse me, the NSRs are 3 times higher, right? The margins are going to expand, and you could actually build that as your starter project, right? Conceivably, that's what our goals are. And that's why we're slowly, systematically showing the evidence to support this goal, right? Do we need to combine it with Red Dog? Yeah, that's fine too. We have another 52 million tons just 2 kilometers away at Red Dog that's already defined, right? We've got a lot of options to make this an attractive starter operation, right? So it's what can you do? I started 3 years ago. I didn't take a salary. I took it all on options, all of value at risk. For me, this is what I spend 100% of my time and energy on, right? I'm not being paid, so to speak, to sit here and wait for the second half of the cycle, right? It's how do you be relevant in every point in the cycle? How do you actually progress this project at any point in the cycle? Like our long-term massive copper porphyry, that's not going away, right? It'll always be there. So then how do we become relevant this first half of the cycle? Well, I think through gold, which is critical currency, and through higher margins, lower capital intensity project, which we're advancing rapidly.
Sam, do the local Indigenous communities own shares in the company? And if so, what percentage of the float?
It's a great question, and it's coming, right? Like this is, exactly how you create alignment with rights holders, stakeholders, shareholders, everybody, right? This is true partnership. So the answer is no, not yet, but I am absolutely open to that type of partnership, right? Because it just solidifies, it crystallizes that level of trust, it crystallizes that level of alignment. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly not something that has fallen by the wayside. It progresses. I think there's hopefully in the next round of critical metals strategy action plan, rather, from the government, hopefully there is going to be a mechanism that really makes this attractive for all parties, right? It's almost like what we're waiting for right now. And, I think suffice it to say, as I mentioned, I just came off a call, a roundtable discussion with the minister and a number of industry partners in British Columbia. We've been selected as part of a collaborative group to address some of the needs of the industry. So we have a direct line into policymakers here. And, I think the biggest hurdle here is not only funding capacity for First Nations, but also administrative and infrastructure capacity to allow them to, to truly align with our project, our collective project. And that's where the government can be helpful, right? Like, I mean, government's not going to be helpful in terms of solving any reconciliation. It's something that you have to take a much more bespoke approach to with the First Nation groups that you deal with, right? It's not something you can rely on the government to solve for you, right? But they can solve structural things that can facilitate the growth of these relationships. And that's what we're really advocating for. And, hopefully we'll see something productive in the next round of announcements.